In this lecture, we are going to explore another option for writing functions called an arrow function. Arrow functions were introduced to provide a shorter way of writing a function. They're relatively popular within the JavaScript community. Most developers prefer arrow functions over regular functions. Let's explore this feature. Inside your editor, open the main file. Next, clear the contents of the file. First, let's create a regular function for comparison. Inside the file, define a function called hello. Inside this function, we will output a message to the console. Lastly, let's invoke the function. If we refresh the page, the message gets logged. Nothing new so far. Arrow functions are a new way to create functions. The syntax can be a bit confusing at first, but it's definitely more readable once you understand what's going on. To create an arrow function, you need to do the following. First, we can safely remove the function keyword. It's not necessary for defining an arrow function. Next, we can remove the name of the function. Afterward, we can add the following symbols after the parenthesis: equal sign, greater than sign. These characters are referred to as a fat arrow. Lastly, the curly braces can be removed. Instead of putting the console statement on a new line, we can move the message to the same line. This is a very basic example of an arrow function. It's a shorter syntax for writing a function. Straight off the bat, arrow functions are entirely anonymous. If you were to add the name of the function before the parenthesis, this would produce an error. Arrow functions are not meant to be written alone. Primarily, you will either assign an arrow function to a variable or pass it into another function. Let's assign it to a variable. Before the arrow function, assign it to a variable called hello. The value of this variable will be assigned to the arrow function like so. Let's make a side-by-side comparison. I'm going to add a comment above the variable to indicate it's an arrow function. Next, I'm going to create a normal function like the one we had before. Both functions perform the same logic. They're nearly identical as far as functionality goes. The only noticeable difference is the way they're written. Unlike arrow functions, regular functions are usually multi-lined even if you only have a single line of code. Of course, you can always move everything to one line. However, your code becomes less readable. The arrow function is much more readable and shorter to write. I'm going to comment out the regular function. Let's keep working with the arrow function. Multi-line arrow functions are optional. You can create a multi-line arrow function by adding curly brackets to the body of the function. The curly brackets are completely optional if you have one line of code, but required if you have multiple lines. Just like any other function, parameters are supported. I'm going to create a parameter called param1. Multiple parameters can be added by separating them with a comma. For this example, let's stick to one parameter. Let's update the hello function invocation by passing in a message. Next, let's update our function to log the parameter. Lastly, refresh the page. The same behavior occurs. There are two things you should be aware of when using arrow functions. Firstly, parentheses are optional for functions with one parameter. In this example, we have one parameter. If we were to remove the parentheses, the syntax would be considered valid. However, this option is only available if you have one parameter. For example, if an arrow function has 0 parameters, you must have parentheses. If you have one parameter, parentheses are optional. If you have 2 or more parameters, you're required to have parentheses. The other thing to be aware of is that arrow functions do not have a scope. As an example, let's create an object called foo. This object will have a property called num. The num property will be set to 10. Next, we will create a function called lognum that logs the num property. Lastly, we're going to run the function. There are two options to reference the num property. We can use the foo variable name or the this keyword. The this keyword is the most commonly used option. If we refresh the page, the number gets logged. Let's try changing our solution to arrow functions. I'm going to remove the fat arrow. Lastly, I'm going to refresh the page to view the results. The console will output undefined. Arrow functions don't have a scope. As a result, the this keyword doesn't point to the object. Normally, JavaScript wouldn't have a problem finding the property. However, arrow functions throw it off course. If we're trying to log the num property, the console statement will need to be updated to use the foo variable. If we refresh the page, the console should output the property. That's about all there is to it. Arrow functions are popular for two reasons. The first reason is that it's easier to read and write than regular functions. The second reason is that the scope becomes less of a problem. Arrow functions share the scope of the parent, which can be helpful. In future lectures, we'll look at how arrow functions can be helpful over regular functions. I know it may not seem like a big deal, but the advantages become clearer when writing larger applications. Throughout this course, we will heavily use arrow functions.